Well, not really a question. We're going to start off with this statement. Instead of constantly exposing the flaws regarding Darwin's theory of evolution, of which there are many, CET provides a tool or framework for research that allows Bible-believing scientists and laypersons to make a much stronger and sounder case for discovering and understanding the truth about how all living things adapt to their environment. And all living things do adapt to their environment. But that's not evolution, okay? So, in the form of a question, I'm going to say, can employing engineering principles to the study and analysis of living organisms and their ability to adapt to environmental changes provide a better explanation for those changes than the use of the term natural selection? Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I imagine that most of you have heard the term natural selection before. So in short, if I were to answer this question, I'd say, well, yes, otherwise, why would I have put together a PowerPoint presentation and come here to share with you, okay? So what we're going to do today is we're going to be looking at some of God's creation from an engineer's viewpoint. Now, that shouldn't frighten any of you. You don't have to have a background or a degree in engineering to recognize engineering principles when you see them, okay? All we have to do is understand a few basic premises and a few basic things about engineering, and then when we look at biology, we can say, wow, that looks like it was engineered. So I'm going to do a quick audio-video check, and just to make sure you've got those things turned off. You wouldn't want to be the one to have everybody turn around and look at you when the phone rings, okay? All right, I want to start by introducing you to this fellow here. Does anybody recognize this face, other than myself and my wife and a few others maybe? This is Dr. Randy Galuza. He is the president of the Institute for Creation Research. They are based out of Dallas, Texas, about an hour's drive from here, okay? Pretty close by. So you've got a really cool deal going on here in Texas. He has authored several books, and he's appeared in several others, and also in some DVDs. And in July of 2016, so many years ago, Dr. Galuza began to propose a model for Bible-believing scientists to guide biological research based on engineering principles. Let me just give you a little bit about his background. He has a BS in engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, a BA in theology from Moody Bible Institute, an MD from the University of Minnesota, and a Master of Public Health from Harvard University. He served 9 years in the Navy Civil Engineer Corps and is a registered professional engineer. In 2008, he retired as a lieutenant colonel from the Air Force, where he served as 28th Bomb Wing Flight Surgeon and Chief of Aerospace Medicine. He then joined the Institute for Creation Research as their national representative and was appointed as their president of their organization in 2020. So he has a really good pedigree going on here. And I mentioned that Institute for Creation Research, they're located just a few miles east of the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. And it just so happens, I'm just going to put a quick plug in for them, on the third Sabbath of each month at 4:30 in the afternoon, they open the doors to a Day 4 astronomy meeting. They host it at their Discovery Center. It's free admission to go in there. The event starts at 5 and goes to 6. And so every month there's something about astronomy that people can go in. It's all done from a creationist perspective. All right, back to Dr. Galuza. He formed this question. Since his background initially was in engineering and then into medicine, he formulated this question. Have living things been engineered for life, or is all of life just a cosmic, biological, against all odds accident? In other words, are we engineered for life? Did God do it all? Or are we just an against all the odds accident, okay, which was Darwin's idea of everything, okay? Darwin didn't want to believe in God because he had his own personal issues, which we're not going to get into today. But continuous environmental tracking is a component of a much larger paradigm, which the Institute for Creation Research advocates, and it is known as TOBD, the Theory of Biological Design. This is an overarching framework for approaching the study of biology. Now, y'all say, well, wait a minute, I don't study biology, I'm not, I don't have that kind of a background. I'm just going to give you just a brief graphic of what it looks like here. Okay, these are all the components of a theory of biological design. You say, that's too complicated for me. You don't have to understand all that. I'm just showing you that continuous environmental tracking is just a subset of a bigger picture of how to understand biology. And brains more competent than mine are looking into it. Okay, so I'm not going to try to go into detail to describe it all. But woven into all this is continuous environmental tracking. And in continuous environmental tracking, Dr. Galuza had I'm not sure exactly what adjective I want to put on that, but he proposed a rather bold suggestion. He says that we should do away with the term natural selection. He says we really shouldn't even be using it. It was a term that was coined by Darwin. Well, why should we let them control the narrative? Okay, if the Bible is true and God did create everything, then we don't have to use the language of the evolutionists or the people who deny that there's a creator God to try to explain what we're seeing. Okay, so instead, Dr. Galuza prefers the term engineered biology. Is biology engineered? Was it designed by somebody with a brilliant engineering mind, like God, or was it all just cosmic biological accident? Now, why does Dr. Galuza say this? Well, because I created this little diagram here. You have an organism. The organism lives within an environment, okay? And we'll call the environment nature. Do you see the black line represented by the organism? That is the organism-environment interface. And when an organism interacts with its environment, it is the organism that adapts to the environment. It is not the environment forcing changes on the organism, okay? And that was how Darwin viewed changes over time. So in order for an organism to adapt to its environment, it has to sense its environment. So I put this little radar screen up there to say this organism, and really this can apply to every organism, from the smallest bacteria to the biggest critter, it is going to have the ability to sense its environments. So the Institute for Creation Research, right now they're doing some research on blind cavefish. And if you've ever had a chance to learn anything about this, this is one of the arguments that evolutionists use to say, see, over vast periods of time, these fish find themselves in a cave where it's all dark, and they lose their ability to have eyes. Okay, and their pigment starts to change, okay, to adapt to this cave environment. And they say that this takes place because of random mutations operating over generations and generations of fish. So the Institute for Creation Research right now is doing research to show that if they take fish that have sight and put them in a dark environment, that within 2 or 3 generations, that generation will have lost its sight and its pigments will start to change. They can take fish that were born and have lived in a cave environment and are blind, bring them into a lit environment, and within 2 or 3 generations, their offspring have eyes and their pigments change to normal. It doesn't take millions of years, and it doesn't take mutations. This ability to adapt and change is programmed into the fish, and this is like some of their cutting-edge research. It's quite fascinating. It's just one area of research, but it's one of the ones that they're working on developing right now. If you were to take a visit to their Discovery Center, you could see an area that they have displayed where they have these different fish at the different stages of development. I want to quickly revisit Darwin's original work. His book was called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. But there's more. There's a secondary title, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, I could spend the better part of an hour describing Darwin's racist and sexist views, but we don't have time to go for that. But I want to go into this book because in chapter 4, it reads this way. It may be metaphorically said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up that which is good, silently and incessantly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of every organic being. I want you to notice the action verbs that Charlie uses in this imaginary world of his. He says that nature is scrutinizing, rejecting, preserving, adding up, incessantly working. He is attributing nature with the power of volition, the ability to make choices. Does this remind you of a scripture or two? maybe Romans 1:25. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. You see, it must be noted first and foremost that Darwin knew essentially nothing about the cell or about genetics. The discovery of DNA came 93 years after The Origin of Species was published and 71 years after his death. Darwin believed that the cell was just a simple blob of protoplasm that just held things together. It didn't do anything. Well, thanks to microbiology and the microscopes, scanning electron microscopes, we can look now into the cell at levels that Darwin never had even an inkling to dream about. And we can see that it is vastly more complex than a city. So what about how natural selection acts? He says natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight, successive variations. She can never take a great and sudden leap, although like evolution, like nature could leap. Nature doesn't leap. But it must advance by short and sure, though slow steps. Now, reiterating a point that he makes a few pages earlier, he says this, and this is important. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by, catch this, numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. In the scientific world, this is known as the falsification test, okay? What you can't really, in many respects, prove anything, but what you can do is disprove everything else, and what you're left with is what you accept as the truth. So we're going to be looking at this again, numerous successive slight modifications. Now, Darwin attributed characteristics of volition upon nature that nature simply does not possess. He made comparisons to human breeders selecting for desired traits, and it is faulty in that making an abstract comparison to human volition does not endow nature with that trait. In other words, just saying that nature does it doesn't mean that nature actually does it, okay? So he can make the claim, but can he back it up? I'm here to tell you, no, he can't. But yet there are people every day believing this, okay, because they've never been able to take a serious look. They've never had a hard chance to look at the other contrary way of looking at it. In other words, they have a different worldview. And we're going to look at how that impacts our study of biology. So then, how does the model of continuous environmental tracking better explain the ability for organisms to adapt? Well, to understand that, let's quickly go back to God's original dominion mandate, which was this. Genesis 1:22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas and let fowl multiply in the earth. Then referring to the birds and the fishes, he says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then to Noah, after the flood, he says this, bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So, Noah was disembarking from the ark. God repeated this command to all the critters. So we can see that God had it in mind for his created creatures to adapt so that they could multiply, so that they could fill the earth. Now, at the same time, we know just from common sense and our own observations that not every single organism is fitted to adapt to every single environment on the planet Earth, okay? Like for instance, I could not live where emperor penguins could live, okay? And that's all right with me because I don't think emperor penguins want to live in Heber-Overgaard, Arizona, elevation 6,700 feet. But if it was God's plan for critters to adapt, then I'm going to ask you this question. Would he or would he not also have given them the ability to adapt to the differing environments and ecosystems that they would encounter in the post-flood worlds? Is this reasonable or unreasonable? Well, we would have to say if that was God's plan, then yes, he would have to give them the ability to make those adaptations. Well, humans adapt to their environment too, but you know what? We're still humans. We use our senses to determine if conditions are less than optimal, and we will make biological adjustments, okay? Just a simple example. If it's too cold, what do? You start shivering, okay? If it's too hot, you start perspiring. If you inhale too much dust or pollen, what happens? You start sneezing, all right? And sometimes if you don't like your environment, you move to like Texas. It's not a bad deal. Texas is quite a cool place. I really like Texas here. Romans 1:20 says this, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Now this expression, "what has been made," shows up one other time in the Greek. It is found in Ephesians 2:10, where it says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them." The idea of workmanship denotes a workman, okay, somebody who crafts something. So what Romans 1:20 is telling us is that God's workmanship is clearly seen by whom? By everyone, okay? So in other words, no one has any excuse for not seeing God's workmanship in the things of nature and not giving him the praise he is due. But there are people who are going to turn a blind eye to that, and they're going to say, no, I'm going to choose to believe that everything got here by accident so that I don't have to be accountable to God. Well, pretending that God exists doesn't take away God's existence. All right, so let's get deep into this continuous environmental tracking. Not CRT, CET. Why does it say that? Well, I guess I got something to fix. All right. Here are the three things, and you're going to see these over and over again. The first of all, you have to have input sensors to detect changes in the environment. Like I said, there was the little radar thing I had up there, right? Then, those input sensors bring in data. You have to have internal programming to compare that input data to reference values to select a suitable response. And then the response is carried out by output actuators to execute those specific responses. Now you say, okay, I'm not a scientific person. I haven't been in a classroom for a while. I'm having a little trouble understanding this. Don't worry. We're going to kind of repeat it and repeat it and repeat it again, and you're going to get it, all right? The engineering principles that underlie how human design things self-adjust to changing environments is the most expedient way to explain how organisms adapt. Now, keeping those three things in mind, right? Input sensors to detect changes in the environment, internal programming to compare input data to reference values, and output actuators to execute responses, all right? In other words, this is where the changes in the organism come. Now, I'm going to show you a short video produced by Subaru many years ago, just to give you a heads up on how human engineers work.
It is through 50 years of daring that we have been able to offer drivers peace of mind. 50 years of designing cars for crash survival that led us to our most revolutionary feature yet. A car that can see trouble and stop itself to avoid it.
What components did this automobile need in order to avoid crashing? It needed input sensors to detect the coming obstacle. It needed internal programming to analyze the distance and velocity to determine the exact time to activate the brakes. And it needed output actuators to execute the braking sequence. If you were to go to Subaru and suggest that they just accidentally, just from randomly throwing together parts, created this system, they would laugh at you, okay? It took a team of engineers working many hours, okay, over quite a long period of time to develop a self-activated braking system. When we look at how human engineering works, we can say, wow, are there parallels in the biological world? Yes, there are, and that's what we're going to be studying for the rest of the time this morning. Pastor Adam, what is the hard time that we need to stop by? 10:35, okay, I think we can do this. Darwin postulated that organisms are like clay to be shaped by their environment. In other words, the environment is the active agent and the organism is the passive agent. That's how Darwin saw things, okay? He saw it more like modeling clay. But we're going to proceed under the premise that the organism responds by sensing the environment, running it across a logic circuit, and then executing output actuators. right? Internal sensors, input sensors, internal programming, output actuators to direct those functional changes. So, now a few more points to tidy up before we launch into the actual observations. It is an entity's traits, not its exposures, that determine design success or failure. Because we said not every organism is engineered to adapt to every kind of environment. We have, in the human terms, what are called design parameters, okay? And those can be limited by available materials or the cost of construction or what have you. But in nature, okay, in God's created nature, there are certain limits that certain things are not going to be able to survive in every kind of environment. To help clarify the application of this approach to biology, we'll consider some examples of how design traits contribute to successful performance. Now, Dr. Galuza wrote an article in July of 2017 about continuous environmental tracking. He mentions this: when Hurricane Michael blew through Mexico Beach, Florida in October 2018, the homes in entire neighborhoods were flattened, but in one neighborhood, a single home surrounded by devastation was left virtually unscathed. A Fox News headline called it a miracle home. But miraculous explanations aren't needed. The home was engineered with design features specifically intended to solve the problems associated with hurricanes. Here is a picture of the home that survived the hurricane. Now, the home was owned by a Dr. LeBron Lackey. He designed or engineered the house to withstand winds of 250 miles an hour. Okay? He said, I want this home built to survive. So, let me ask you a hypothetical question. Did Dr. Lackey's home survive in October 18 because Hurricane Michael selected for his home and selected against all the others that were destroyed? Talking about natural selection, right? You say, well, that's really absurd, okay? Well, what enabled Dr. Lackey's home to survive was that it was engineered ahead of time to survive that kind of conditions. Does anybody remember the fires that raged across Hawaii in August of last year, right? And a lot of homes were destroyed, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. There was one home that was built to be fire resistant. Did nature select for this home and select against all the other homes? You say, oh, come on, now you're talking in absurd terms. Well, we say, yeah, but does nature behave the same way with other organisms? No. Now, an evolutionist might say, well, it's not fair to compare a biological system to a non-biological system. They might say, well, that's like comparing apples to John Deere tractors or something. So, but what we need to understand is we do see parallels, okay? We're not trying to make a comparison between biological and not. We're just saying, do you see the basic principle involved? Things survive because they were engineered to survive. Things adapt because they are built to adapt. So, we mentioned design parameters. In human engineering terms, I don't know of a single car built that can withstand being T-boned by an Amtrak train, okay? Things do have their limits. But the question is, are we looking at clay or are we looking at awesome design? And there's a few more points to consider. These changes, like I mentioned with the fish, they are regulated as opposed to random. They are rapid as opposed to long, slow, gradual processes. They are repeatable in terms of being predictably consistent. It happens again and again and again. And these changes are targeted to address the needs of the organism. So, with that in mind, let's begin by looking at frogs. Not this guy, okay? And this guy's cute, but that's not the one we're looking at either. I'm not sure about this guy here, okay? But how about this little critter right here? This is a wood frog. And you say, okay, he's cute and all. How does he adapt? What's the big deal with this guy? Well, he has two scientific names, which I won't try to pronounce. The only frog discovered living north of the Arctic Circle. In the winter, the wood frog goes into extreme hibernation. What is that? Well, to prevent cellular destruction from freezing, the frog goes on a sugar high by manufacturing high levels of glucose in its body. The glucose lowers the freezing point of the frog and provides enough energy to keep the cells alive in sub-freezing temperatures. The glucose also inhibits metabolic reactions like urea production from taking place, so it's not building up a bunch of waste products and toxins in its body while it's hibernating. Normally, high glucose levels would kill the frog, but in this case they don't, because it also slows down the frog's metabolism. When ice crystals first start to form on the frog's skin, a message travels to the frog's liver to convert much of its stored glycogen into glucose. 5 minutes after the signal is received, the sugar level in the frog's blood begins to increase. And notice that the glucose spike only occurs just before the frog freezes. Well, how is this? During this period, the heart stops beating and the lungs quit functioning. Say, what? It takes about a day for the wood frog to thaw, starting from the inside and moving outwards. The signals that stimulate the heart to start beating again and the lungs to start working again are still unknown. They're still studying this critter. So what do we have here? We have input sensors to detect the ice on the frog's skin. We have internal programming to determine that it needs to engage its output actuators to trigger the cascade of processes to flood the frog with glucose. Now, does this make sense? Or is it easier to believe that this happened because of numerous successive slight modifications? And is it regulated as opposed to random, rapid as opposed to long, slow, and gradual, repeatable in terms of being predictably consistent, and targeted to meet the needs of the organism? Yes, 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 and yes. Darwin loses, God wins, round one. Let's look at the Arctic ground squirrel. The Arctic ground squirrel lives, guess where? The Arctic, yeah. The scientific name is whatever this guy is. Lives in Alaska, Siberia, and northwestern Canada. Average size is about 15 inches, and its weight will vary during the season. They dig shallow burrows due to the tundra and the permafrost. Right? They only go so deep before it's rock hard. Females will hibernate from early August to late April, males from late September to early April. During hibernation, the core body temperature can run as low as -3 Celsius or -27 Fahrenheit, and it drops its pulse to about 1 beat per minute. Researchers believe it is able to rid itself of ice nucleators, thereby preventing ice from forming in its body during the hibernation cycle. Here's a little video to help you see what's going on.
This little squirrel just came out of the freezer, but it's not dead. And scientists like Sarah Rice want to know why.
There's no cardiac arrest, there's no stroke. They're obese, but there's no ill effects, there's no bone loss.
This is an Arctic ground squirrel, and during hibernation, it can chill its body down to the freezing point, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the only mammal that we know can get that cold.
And then they wake up and they're just fine in the springtime.
Pretty cool for a little critter. I say pretty cool, no pun intended, right? How does this little ground squirrel survive? Because it has input sensors to detect the onset of Arctic winter. It has internal programming to distinguish a sudden cold snap from the actual onset of winter. And it has output actuators to eliminate the ice nucleators from its body. Are we seeing this, or are we seeing numerous successive slight modifications? No. And we say that yes, all of these responses were regulated, they were rapid, they repeat themselves with each generation of Arctic ground squirrel, and they're targeted to meet the needs of the organism. Cool. 2 up, 2 down. What about flowers? This particular one shown is an evening primrose. We want to see how they react to honeybees. My former boss, my former president, Dr. Joseph Gazelle, speaks on this in a talk he has on honey and the bees. I got this following information from this issue of Creation magazine here. This was from the October 2019, an article written by Dr. David Catchpole. It's called Hear Bee, Make Nectar. Now follow this. Not only can plants hear, but they can rapidly respond to certain sounds. New research has shown when a recording of the sound of a bee buzzing nearby was played back to evening primrose flowers, the flowers, began producing sweeter nectar. Within only 3 minutes from the first sound exposure, that was the time researchers had to wait to collect a quantity of new nectar required for their measuring equipment to work, the concentration of sugar in the nectar increased by about 20% on average. So this flower detects bee wing buzzes and starts immediately producing a higher sugar concentrate. Bees can discern concentration differences as small as 1 to 3%. So even allowing for old nectar diluting the newer product, it would still be a significant incentive, now follow this, for the bees to more regularly visit flowers of that species and to stay longer when they do, increasing the chance of pollination. That's a win-win. The researchers found that the sound of buzzing bees caused the flowers to vibrate. This suggests a key role of the flower, particularly the petals, in directly receiving or at least enhancing the reception of the bee sound. In other words, the flower functions like an ear, says the researchers. The point of all this, as the researchers explained, producing high-grade nectar all the time would use a lot of the plant's resources, and, listen to this, exposed nectar is subject to degradation by microbes. So it would not be helpful for the plant to produce high-quality nectar all the time for a couple different reasons. So a mechanism for timing the production of enhanced reward for the bees to a time when pollinators are likely to be present could be and is highly beneficial for the plant. Indeed, a win-win for both species. This temporary boost in sugar content can last for up to 6 minutes, and during that time, pollinators were 9 times more likely to visit those flowers as opposed to flowers that don't increase their sugar content. The author concludes by saying this: of course, the researchers attribute this to evolution, but describing an organism's hitherto unrealized feature and its usefulness is not the same as explaining its origin. Rather, who'd have ever thought of a flower being akin to an ear? Answer, the one the Bible says made the flowers and the bees and everything else in this mind-bogglingly complex creation that continues to surprise and delight. And there's the source, if you want to take a picture of that, and I put a QR code up in case you want to visit the actual website. It's online. You can read the article in its entirety. Well, what do flowers have? Input sensors to detect the bee's wings vibrations, internal programming to recognize those vibrations as being within the frequencies relative to pollinators, and it has to have an output actuator to initiate the process of increasing the nectar production. Sweet, as the kids would say, especially if you like honey, right? So what is the falsification test for Darwin? He said, if it could be demonstrated that no organism existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications. This isn't numerous, successive, slight. This is all right there from the get-go. And this response is regulated, it's rapid, it's repeatable, and it is targeted. Now, while we're on the subject of plants, I also found this article here in Creation magazine from January 2019, also written by the same author, David Catchpole. He happens to be a plant physiologist. This one tells us that plants are listening. This is interesting here. A news release from the University of Western Australia announced that plants have far more complex and developed senses than we thought, with the ability to detect and respond to sounds. In particular, fascinating research has shown that seedling roots can hear the sound of gurgling water. Really? Researchers grew pea seedlings in pots shaped like an upside-down Y, such that roots had a two-way choice. They grew towards wet soil rather than dry soil, or aimed for a tray of water instead of the dry soil. Remarkably, when one of the choices was a sealed pipe through which water flowed, seedling roots grew towards it rather than dry soil. So I put together this little illustration of what that would have looked like, okay? So you have water flowing through a pipe on one side, and the vibrations caused by the water cause the plant to direct the roots down that tube instead of the other, even though the soil content, as far as moisture, was identical in both sides. But the roots knew that they should go towards that sound of gurgling water. They just knew water was there, even if the only thing to detect was the sound of it flowing inside the pipe, explained lead researcher Monica Gagliano. And in the instance of wet soil being offered as an alternative, the plant roots grew towards it rather than the gurgling pipe. Well, yeah, because there's moisture there, and they know it's more immediate. Prompting the researcher to surmise that plants use sound waves to detect water at a distance, but home in on actual moisture when it is nearer. Dr. Gagliano explained the research indicates that the invasion of sewer pipes by tree roots may be based on the plants hearing water, and shows that their perception of their surroundings is much greater and far more complex than we previously thought. Imagine that. And there's a QR code and the website if you want to ever visit that place there. So the plants don't just detect moisture, They can detect the vibrations of water flowing through a pipe underground. They have to have input sensors to detect the vibrations of moving water. They need to have internal programming to recognize that frequency and related sounds as being produced by water, even if it's in a pipe, and output actuators to direct root development in the direction of the underground water source. Darwin said it was numerous successive slight modifications. What we're seeing here is regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted. Mighty Casey has struck out again. Well, let's continue on. Let me introduce you to this handsome fellow here. This is a bluehead wrasse fish. Some interesting facts about the bluehead wrasse. His scientific name is, whatever it is, yeah. They live in and around the Caribbean. Unlike most fish, they swim mainly with their pectoral fins. They're a popular addition to saltwater aquariums. The larvae bury themselves in the sand until they emerge as juveniles, and they're very bold and may approach humans in the water. Okay, yeah. Is there more? Absolutely. And here's what it looks like when they're swimming. Now you see that there's a male, and he's got bright blue and stripes and color. The females are rather plain. So they live in, for want of a better term, okay, a harem. One male and several concubines, if you will. Now, while that might seem interesting to teenage boys, these are fish, okay? So it's not such a big deal. The male is bigger, and he has coloration that makes him stand out a lot more against his female counterparts, and that would make him a more tempting target for predators. So what happens if the male blue-headed wrasse is taken from the harem? A female from the harem will transform into a male. Within minutes of the male's absence, the largest female in the group will begin the transformation process. Within 10 days, the ovaries have shriveled and testes are fully functional. Within 20 days, all anatomical features, the colorations, the markings, everything of the male are complete. And this is only one species of fish. Researchers have identified more than 500 fish species that regularly change sex as adults. Clownfish begin life as males and change to females. Kobudai do the opposite. Some, including gobies, can change sex back and forth. The transformation may be triggered by age, size, or social status. Now, that's okay for fish. In our culture today, though, there seems to be a bit of a problem. There are some people who are experiencing confusion over this. Well, human sex traits are not determined by the same epigenetics that work for the fish here. Our genetics are determined by chromosomes. You have XX if you're the fairer sex, or XY if you're a guy, okay? And there's no back and forth, and there's no changing, okay? These critters do it by, let's say, epigenetics. There are markers or tags on their DNA that move around and say, turn this on, turn this off, turn this on, turn this off, and that can happen. With us, it doesn't happen. Input sensors to detect the absence of the male, internal programming to recognize the input as requiring activation of the epigenetic sequences, and output actuators to initiate and regulate the gender transformation process. Amazing. No hormone therapies, no gender reassignment surgeries. The fish do it all by themselves. What is the falsification test? Numerous excessive slight modifications? Nope. What we're seeing here is regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted. Since we're on the subject of fish, I have found another one here. This guy, he's a crucian carp. He lives in lakes, ponds, and slow-moving rivers from England to Russia and above the Arctic Circle. In winter, massive snow accumulations cover the water, blocking out light, severely reducing the oxygen level in the water. Lack of oxygen generally leads to toxic buildup of lactic acid in marine critters, resulting in their death. But however, when the crucian carp detects low oxygen levels, it alters its metabolic activity to enable it to survive without oxygen. Laboratory experiments have shown the fish to survive without oxygen for over 4.5 months. Can you survive without oxygen for 4.5 months? 4.5 minutes? 4.5 seconds? I won't bother to describe all the complex chemical reactions that make this happen, other than to say input sensors to detect the oxygen level in the water, internal programming to determine whether or not to transition to the anaerobic metabolism, and output actuators to initiate and regulate this metabolic transition. Numerous excessive slight doesn't even come close. Regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted does. Here's something that you might be a little more familiar with, the 9-banded armadillo. The only species of armadillo living in the United States, primarily Texas. The only vertebrate animal to give birth to identical quadruplets every time. Once the single egg is fertilized, it splits into 4 embryos, each identical, that share the same placenta. Okay? But sometimes the female armadillo senses that conditions for pregnancy are not optimal, such as food scarcity or climate conditions. The mother that can then put the developing armadillo babies into a dormant state for up to 4 months. Hundreds of chemical changes had to happen to enable the gestation process to be halted, not merely slowed down. The gestation process stops completely until it's triggered to reactivate. Input sensors to detect the environmental hazard, internal programming to determine whether or not to delay gestation of offspring, and output actuators to initiate and regulate the suspension of the gestation process. Are we seeing this, or are we seeing this? Regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted. Now I'm going to shift a little bit of gears here from biology to a little bit of botany. We're going to look at corn. You say, corn? How on earth does corn employ continuous environmental tracking? Well, sometimes cornfields are invaded by caterpillars. A caterpillar invades a cornfield and begins munching on a particular corn plant in the field. The corn plant begins releasing volatile chemical compounds called pheromones that are sensed by the other nearby corn plants in the field. The other corn plants begin to produce a different volatile compound that attracts parasitoid wasps to the cornfield. Parasitoid means that they don't eat, their young do, okay? The wasps lay their eggs under the caterpillar's skin. The eggs hatch and the wasp larvae eat the caterpillar. The corn plant does not respond to routine damage to its leaves like wind or hail. The corn plant's defense is triggered by the presence of caterpillar saliva. The compounds that attract the wasps do not have any effect on the ears of the corn. They don't like spraying a toxic chemical. It is a pre-designed organic pest control system. What do you think about that? And what are the 3 components? You have to have input sensors to detect the caterpillar saliva. You have to have internal programming to recognize the threat as being distinct from routine damage from rain or hail or what have you. And output actuators to release the volatile compounds. But wait, this is just for the plant that's being attacked. The other corn plants have to have input sensors to detect the volatile compounds from the first plant. They have to have internal programming to recognize that compounds are signaling an attack by caterpillars. And then they have to have output actuators to release new volatile compounds to attract the parasitoid wasps. A 2-stage organic pest control system, you say. No, it is a 3-stage organic pest control system, because not only that, but the wasps themselves have to have input sensors to detect the volatile compounds. They need to have internal programming to recognize the compounds and the direction from which they're coming, and output actuators to direct the wasps to the affected cornfield to lay their eggs. A 3-stage organic pest control system. Are you kidding me? 3-stage organic pest control systems do not self-assemble by random, unguided, mutated processes. They don't. And the farmers in Kansas will tell you that. Numerous successive slight modifications, regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted. Well, I have one more, but I'm looking at the clock, and I'm hoping that we can get through this. E. coli bacteria. I may have to skip some of the narrative on this. E. coli, we hear about that in the news because it gets into lettuce fields and stuff like that and contaminates them. You can't. Most E. coli bacteria are harmless. In fact, there's a whole bunch of them living inside your gut lining right now. Okay? And they're friendly. It's the ones that mutate that become problematic. I was reading about this in this particular article of Creation Magazine. This is the January, February, March issue. From 2022, only 2 years ago. Talked about the okapi on the cover. And I would highly recommend you get a subscription to that. Here was the article called E. coli's electric motor, a marvel of design. I put the QR code on this one here. E. coli first became popular in 1996 when this book was published by Dr. Michael Behe, professor of biological science at Lehigh University. It was he who first coined the term irreducible complexity. Now, I'm going to skip through this here, but it talks about the E. coli has a little hair-like motor that spins around at 22,800 revolutions per minute, but some bacteria have been known to spin at 102,000 revolutions per minute. 102,000 revolutions per minute. 2,000 of these little hairs could line up across the width of a human hair. They're that tiny. It took really powerful electron microscopes to figure out their detail, their construction. There's 40 different parts that go into this. Each different color is a different type of protein that assembles to make this thing. The base of the motor is surrounded by a central gear with up to 11 powered gears. In other species, as many as 18. The drive shaft passes through a ring of proteins, and they have like if you take two magnets that have the same polarity and you put them together, you know how they repel against each other? Well, these component parts have a similar reaction. They don't actually physically touch, okay? They're like float against each other. So it makes this thing almost frictionless, almost 100% efficient without friction. That's why they can spin at those speeds and not overheat and burn themselves up. Then it has this gear mechanism. This is kind of what it looks like. It changes direction, okay? It has these little yellow wheels. Those are the drive wheels, and you see the blue ring. If it's on the inside, it causes it to go counterclockwise. If it's on the outside, it causes it to go clockwise, to reverse. Well, this little mechanism, okay, this little bacteria that's swimming around, if it encounters a thicker fluid medium, it needs more torque to drive it. So what does it do? It senses that it needs more power behind its motor, so it kicks in extra power gears to give it more torque as it needs, which will consume a little more energy. So as soon as it does not need those extra gears, they drop back out. And so we have input sensors to detect the viscosity, internal programming to determine how many extra gears it needs, and output actuators to deploy those gears. It also has a navigation system. It has to know where it's going to go to get its next little bite to eat. So a navigation system needs input sensors to detect chemical gradients in the surrounding medium. It needs internal programming to decide whether I want to go towards this or away from it, and output actuators to reverse the direction of these drive motors. And these drive motors can stop and change direction in a quarter of a turn. Your car or your pickup cannot go into reverse in a quarter of a turn. You'll blow your transmission up. Numerous successive flight? No, this is regulated, rapid, repeatable, and targeted. And the conclusion here, the very last part down here, it says, the function, control, and construction of E. coli's electric motor shows layers upon layers of sophisticated design and engineering. This motor brings glory to its designer, our Creator, Jesus Christ. Can we all say amen to that? Now, I want to just quickly go back to this idea of natural selection. I think what we can all say to Mr. Darwin after all of this is, sorry, Charlie. It doesn't work. Dr. Galuza wraps up this article by saying, continuous environmental tracking also establishes a better basis for research by encouraging the exploration of the inherent mechanisms of adaptation, rather than just supposing that it all just happened, like the evolutionists have to say, by random Darwinian processes, leading to a better understanding of how God created every living thing to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I got 10:28, so I have just a few minutes left. We said our amen. Now, we talked about the falsification test for Darwin's theory. So I want to ask you this question here. Does the Bible have a falsification test for God? And I'm going to say yes and no. It's more of a validation test. And I'm going to cite you two verses. Jeremiah 29:13. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And Hebrews 11:6, and without faith it is impossible to please God, because whoever comes to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. If anyone seeks after God and sincerely wants God to reveal himself in their lives, God will make himself known. It happened in my life 40 plus years ago. Hebrews chapter 7 goes on to say this. For the law never made anything perfect, but now we have confidence in a better hope through which we draw near to God. And verse 25 says, consequently, he is able for all time to save those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. And James 4 verse 8 says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. This is just one of the manifold promises of God. I hope that this presentation this morning inspires all of you to draw near to God,